Hey guys, welcome to the next video, the next lesson for this unit on early American history. So this one's going to be about, it's a review of the road to revolution, how the United States became the United States, and it reviews some of the key moments in the American Revolution leading up to the war for independence. And it's going to discuss the United States transitioning from being colonies of Great Britain to us being our own independent country. So let's get started. And before we jump right into the Revolutionary War, we need to talk about another very important war, which was the French and Indian War, which is known in the rest of the world as the 7 Years' War, even though it actually started in 1754 in the colonies and it lasted until 1763. So I know you guys know that's not 7 years. It actually, and the reason why it's not 7 years is because it actually started earlier in the colonies before it ended up spreading to the rest of the world, right? And so the rest of the world, they call it the 7 Years' War. The two main enemies in this war were Great Britain and France, and they were fighting for control of North America. You know, who was going to be the dominant European country in North America. And this war didn't just happen in North America. Actually, this happened, there were battles in Asia, there were battles in Europe. So this was really the first true world war. And the end result of this war was Great Britain defeating France, and they ended the war, with a treaty called the Treaty of Paris, which would be the first of many treaties of Paris that are in US history. But this one was signed in 1763, and Great Britain gained all of North America east of the Mississippi River. So Florida, any territory that had been controlled by France, or at least France claimed it, because, you know, obviously there were hundreds of thousands of Native Americans who lived in these areas, some of whom had sided with the French in these battles, and a few that had sided with the British. So there were some deep consequences for those tribes who sided with the French. You know, they would have to pay. As you can see in this map, the boundaries on the left, right over here, this is where it was divided by France and Great Britain before the French and Indian War, right? And this was it after, on the right, afterwards. All the area in pink was now under control of Great Britain. And some other effects of the French and Indian War was that George Washington became known as a military leader, right? The colonies also united against a common enemy, right, for the first time to fight France and their Native American allies. And also Native American conflicts with the Native Americans and you know, the conflict between Native Americans and the colonists, there had always been some tension and unease there, and there were several wars that were fought between them in the past. And because of this war, those actually increased and would continue to increase. Most of the natives, as I mentioned before, they had sided with the French. So now, as a result of this war, their loss in this war, the colonists end up, they start moving on to even more native land, which had been formerly overseen by the French. But as you know, the French and Native Americans, they had a much better relationship with each other than the British and the Native Americans had. So, you know, all these colonists moving on to this new land created some problems. So what ended up happening was Britain passed the Proclamation of 1763. And this proclamation, it forbade the colonists, it prevented the colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains, right? And onto a lot of American native lands, right? The British were trying to prevent the colonists from doing that. It also, another effect was that it increased the number of troops in the area because they needed soldiers in this area to claim it, the newly won territory, right? The British needed soldiers there to claim it, but they didn't want to increase combat with the Native Americans because they knew that was very expensive. And Britain was already in massive debt because of the war, right? And you know, war is very expensive. You have to pay for soldiers and ships, supplies, for all of that. And they also had to pay for damages from battles. So, you know, war is very expensive. And Britain didn't want to have to pay for more soldiers to be kept in North America, right? To protect the colonists as they move westward. They didn't want to do that. So the British, they need to repay this debt. And so they needed to increase revenue, right, to be able to do that. So how do you increase revenue? Well, I'll show you how they end up doing, how they decided to do that in just a minute. But before we get to that, here is a portrait on this slide of George Washington back during the French and Indian War when he would have been a colonel, right? That's what he would have looked like. And, you know, he's going to later lead the United States in the Revolutionary War. And here is where the proclamation line from 1763 was drawn, right? So the area in dark pink were the colonies, right? The colonies over here in dark pink. And the colonists weren't supposed to move into this area over here, past this line. Do you see it? They weren't supposed to move into this area. It was supposed to be reserved for the Native Americans. But there was a lot of great farmland over there. So of course the colonists end up heading into that area, and they end up causing more conflicts with the Native Americans. And you'll see how that turns out. And then this right here was an emblem designed by Benjamin Franklin. Remember him? He was an important figure that we've kind of been learning about. And this was symbolic. This was symbolic of the colonies joining together to fight against their common enemy, the French. So if they didn't join together to fight the French, they would die, right? So how did the British plan to pay for this massive debt? Taxes, of course, right? So Parliament, which was British, right? British controlled, basically it was their version of Congress, right? They passed several acts that would tax the colonies. After all, you know, the colonies had benefited from the French and Indian War. So their thinking was, since they benefited, why don't they help pay for the debt, you know? And so the first major tax act that they passed was the Sugar Act in 1764. And this was a tax on molasses and other projects, right? And they tried to enforce taxes that had already existed, but they hadn't really done a great job of collecting. So it ended up being repealed before it went into effect because the colonists protested it, right? But when they repealed that, Parliament passed another act called the Declaratory Act, right? Declaratory Act, where they asserted their authority over the colonies. They said they were in we're the ones in charge here, not you. And remember that next year, basically. So in 1765, Parliament ended up passing the Stamp Act next. So this is a tax on numerous types of paper products, and protesters started using the phrase "no taxation without representation." They started to do this a lot. And this phrase had originated many years before, but now they were using it pretty regularly. And if I'm sure you've probably heard this phrase, it's probably pretty familiar. It's a pretty popular saying, right, from the Revolution. So anyway, these protests against the Stamp, there were protests against the Stamp Act, right? And they were organized in large part by a group called the Sons of Liberty, as you can see on the slide. And this group was led by folks like Samuel Adams and John Hancock up in Massachusetts, and they helped form something called the Stamp Act Congress. And this organization issued a formal protest to Parliament, right? Complaining against the Stamp Act, saying it was unjust to pass a tax when the colonists had no voice in Parliament, right? And here again, you have the colonies working together to protest an action by the British government. A couple years later, the Townshend Acts are passed, which taxed a wide range of imported goods, and these were protested again to some success. Most of them were repealed, except for taxes on tea. But the Townshend Acts were repealed in 1770, that same year. And around in that same year, an incident occurred, right, known as the Boston Massacre. This took place, and I mentioned earlier there was an increase in troops in North America, right, after the French and Indian War. And with all these troops in the streets, this led to an increase in tension because many of them also competed with the colonists for jobs, right? Well, on March 5th, 1770, in Boston, several of these soldiers killed some civilians, including Crispus Attucks. And after some protesting had been going on, Crispus Attucks he was an African American, right? And he's considered by many to be the first fatality in the American Revolution. So the soldiers, they went on trial for the massacre, right? But most of them were found not guilty. And in fact, they were defended by a future American president named John Adams. And he would play a key role in the Revolutionary War. But the fact that soldiers were acquitted and the fact that this ended up increasing tension because they were acquitted, right? They weren't found guilty for the murders. So tensions increased even more between the colonists and the British government. Then a couple years later, you have the Gaspé incident, right? The Gaspé incident, where colonists were persecuted or put on trial after they ransacked a sinking British ship. This incident really angered the King of England, right? And Parliament. And colonial assemblies ended up being formed in response to the Boston Massacre and the Gaspé incident, right? And these committees of correspondence, these were called the committees of correspondence, and they were formed in the colonies to communicate with one another so that the colonies could communicate with each other about how they were going to voice their complaints to Parliament, right? And so here is an image on the slide of a famous image of the Boston Massacre, and it was painted or engraved by Paul Revere, who you may have heard of, right? But this picture contains many inaccuracies, you'll notice. For instance, there's no person who would have fit the description of Crispus Attucks, right? In this picture, I don't see anybody in this picture that looks like him. So you'll notice this one that came a little bit later, years later, someone who looks more like Crispus Attucks is right in the middle of the painting. It's actually really drawing attention, you can tell in this picture, to him, right? And this one is more accurate, of course. So, and then the Boston Tea Party happened just a few years later. So 1770 was the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, you have the Boston Tea Party. And this was in response to an act known as the Tea Act. And this act had actually decreased the price of tea, right? And you'd think that it would be great, a lower price for tea, right? If you wanted lower price of Starbucks or something. Except the colonies, the only problem was they could only get their tea from one company, right? The British East India Company. And so this ended up hurting a lot of colonial merchants, right? It'd be like, okay, we're lowering the price of Starbucks, but you can only have Starbucks. You can't get coffee from anywhere else, right? So this upset the colonists and some of the businessmen who were living in the colonies. And they protested this act by boarding 3 ships in Boston Harbor. And these ships they came into Boston Harbor, they were from the British East India Company. And basically the colonists they boarded the 3 ships in the harbor, and they ended up dumping 18,000 pounds of tea into the water in Boston Harbor. And in today's value, this was over $1 million worth of tea. So that was a lot of tea that they dumped, and a lot of money, right? And you'll see here's a portrait that shows this event happening, right? You'll notice the protesters supposedly dressed up as American Indians. You see them on the boat there. They dressed up as American Indians to disguise themselves, right? So how do you think Parliament responded? How did King George III of England respond to this? So they were angry, right? And they respond with the Intolerable Acts, right? The Intolerable Acts in 1774. And these are also known as the Coercive Acts in the colonies because they were so harsh that they shut down Boston Harbor, for example, so no ships could come in. So basically, they did like a blockade, right? And because no ships could come in, it really hurt their economy, right? And the intolerable acts or coercive acts also included the Quartering Act, which meant that British soldiers could stay in private homes. You know, they could kick you out of your home, take it over, live in it. And the Tea Act also introduced martial law, which meant that the military ruled the city. So the soldiers, they were in the streets, right? Soldiers make the laws in martial law in response to this, the colonists, they ended up forming the First Continental Congress, which it was assembled by the committees of correspondence, and they did this to defend the colony's rights to run their own affairs, right? And this in itself was a form of protest to the English government, to the king. And they supported these protests, right? The First Continental Congress, that were going on in Massachusetts. And this right here, you can see on this slide, this was a cartoon um, in this picture. And it kind of sums up the punishment they believed was happening here in America. So you can see here is America in the image. She's right in the middle. She's being stripped, right? Being forced to drink tea. You can see here like a little teapot, right? So she's forced to drink this tea, it's a pretty harsh act. She's being cruelly treated by these people, and those people represent the British government, right? In this cartoon. So shortly after this, the very next year in New England, civilian militias ended up forming, right? So in New England, right? So these civilian militias, also called Minutemen, they had formed up. They were made of Minutemen, and these were basically everyday citizens who stockpiled weapons and ammunition. And originally, the Minutemen, they had stockpiled weapons and formed these groups to resist any kind of conflict with the Native Americans, right? To protect themselves against the Native Americans. But now, these Minutemen and these groups were formed to resist the British Army, right? And so the British soldiers didn't like this, right? They're stockpiling weapons and grouping together. So one day, a group left Boston to head west into Massachusetts to seize and destroy these stockpiles, right? One day, a group of British soldiers went into Massachusetts to destroy these stockpiles of weapons that the Minutemen had been creating. And this was April 19th, 1775. But when the British arrived, first in Lexington, Massachusetts, they were met by these Minutemen, by this local militia, and somebody ended up firing a shot. And we don't know who. I don't think we'll ever know who it was. But this shot, it was called the shot heard round the world. So some shots were exchanged, and several soldiers and militiamen were killed. And now the fighting had truly begun, right? And at first it had been, a battle of ideas. You had maybe some fatalities like Crispus Attucks, like we were talking about. But now there really was a war that had broken out. And it would not end until the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, right? And the Treaty of Paris in 1783 is what would officially end the War for Independence, when Great Britain would recognize the independence of the United States. So here is a painting painted many years later, after the Battle of Lexington. And these are the Minutemen, right? This is what they would have looked like when they faced off against the British Army. And you'll notice the British Army is all in uniform across the way. You can see they're in red, right? the Redcoats. And yeah, you'll notice very regimented. The Minutemen, the militia, the colonists, colonial soldiers are much more everyday garb, right? Look at their clothing. The colonists aren't in uniform like the British. So the Second Continental Congress was meeting it met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1775, and it was meeting before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Then after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, many prominent leaders like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, Benjamin Franklin, they were all there to discuss what to do now. How do they deal with what's going on? So they attempted to, at first, reconcile or make peace with Britain. And they wanted to do this through the Olive Branch Petition, right? But this petition asking for peace, and it was rejected by King George III. And he declared, as you can see in this image here, he declared the colonies to be in rebellion, right here, for suppressing his proclamation. He declared they were in rebellion and sedition, right? So they're traitors. And so basically there's no going back from, there's no fixing it, right? The war is on. So the Second Continental Congress created the Continental Army under the command of George Washington, General George Washington, remember? And he had military experience from the French and Indian War. And so, yeah, here's the rejection though. It basically says they're going to suppress the rebellion and the seditious actions by the colonists. So you can't really reconcile with somebody like that. And it seems like they were ready for war. They had George Washington ready to go. So in 1776, the colonies declared independence. And as I mentioned in my previous lessons, many of the delegates at the Second Continental Congress had read Thomas Paine's Common Sense, right? Which had argued that the colonies were better off separating from Britain and forming their own country. Well, the idea of declaring independence was officially proposed by a man named Richard Henry Lee on June 7th, 1776. And the next month, the Congress voted for independence on July 2nd, 1776, right? And then the Declaration of Independence itself, wasn't formally stated and declared the reasons why. It wasn't formally declared and approved until July 4th, 1776. And that's when we formally told England and the king and declared the reasons why we wanted to be independent, which is why July 4th, 1776 is our Independence Day. And again, this document was mainly written by Thomas Jefferson, but he did have a lot of help from John Adams and Ben Franklin. And this declared the United States as an independent and sovereign nation. And so here's a painting of how this event may have looked, right? And it didn't really look, of course, we know it probably didn't really look like this because a lot of the members of the Congress, the Second Continental Congress, weren't actually there at that time. But this is what it would have looked like in, our imagination. So here's Thomas Jefferson, right? He's the main figure here. He's got a red shirt. And John Adams, Ben Franklin, and a couple others who helped with this. And all the members of the Congress are in the background, you can tell, with John Hancock as well. He's sitting there. So definitely let me know if you have any questions. We are going to pick back up in the next lesson. We're going to take a look at what happened, after the American Revolution and talk about the Articles of Confederation and the creation of the Constitution. We're going to review that. So just let me know if you need any questions, and good luck. Thank you.